Aggressive bikers smashed a luxury car, not realizing that it belonged to Snoop Dogg. What happened afterward shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The streets of Los Angeles shimmered under the glow of neon lights and flickering street lamps. The hum of traffic mixed with the faint echoes of hip-hop beats spilling out of corner stores and passing cars. Murals stretched across the walls of old buildings, depicting faces of past legends and current icons, blending history with defiance. The neighborhood breathed with a rhythm all its own, steady, restless, and alive. Snoop Dogg's black Cadillac DeVille rolled slowly through the streets, its polished chrome rims catching the city lights like fireflies trapped in motion. Behind the wheel, he wore dark sunglasses and a diamond-studded chain that sparkled every time he shifted gears. A faint trail of smoke drifted from his lips as he exhaled, the scent of a freshly rolled blunt mixing with the evening air. People turned their heads as he passed. Some waved, others pulled out phones to snap pictures or record videos. Kids chased the car for half a block before giving up, laughing and yelling his name. The Cadillac moved like royalty through its kingdom, majestic, untouchable, and commanding respect without saying a word. As he pulled up to a familiar corner, he let the car idle. The sight before him triggered memories that hit harder than bass through a subwoofer. Melvin's diner stood just as it always had, its peeling paint and flickering open sign speaking to decades of resilience. It was more than a diner. It was an institution. A place where deals were made, dreams were whispered, and legends like him grabbed a late-night burger after recording sessions. Snoop killed the engine and stepped out. The murmur of conversation inside the diner paused for a moment as heads turned toward the door. A few seconds later, the chatter resumed, along with the scraping of forks and knives on plates. This was home, and he wasn't a guest. "Damn, look who decided to come back and grace us common folk," came a voice from behind the counter. Melvin, the owner, leaned his thick forearms on the counter, his salt and pepper beard trimmed sharp and his apron dusted with flour. Snoop grinned and approached, leaning in to clasp the older man's hand. "You know I can't stay away too long. Place wouldn't survive without me." Melvin laughed, his deep baritone filling the room. "Boy, you act like you own the block. But I'll give it to you. Folks have been talking ever since they saw your car pull up. Thought maybe you came to save us from this mess we're in." Snoop slid into a booth by the window, his eyes scanning the street outside. The neighborhood looked the same, but there was something different in the air. Tense, unspoken, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. "What kind of mess we talking about?" he asked, already half knowing the answer. Melvin wiped his hands on a rag and leaned in closer. "Bikers, mean ones, started showing up a few months back. At first, it was just noise, revving engines, burnouts, showing off. Then they started pushing people around, breaking windows, spray painting walls. Ain't no one doing a damn thing about it. Cops don't care. Folks are scared." Snoop's jaw tightened. He took another look outside, his gaze landing on a trio of motorcycles parked across the street. They weren't there when he pulled up. "Word is they don't like seeing too many faces like yours around here," Melvin added. Snoop didn't reply right away. Instead, he leaned back, letting the words hang. He'd dealt with punks like that before, ones who thought fear was enough to rule a block. The problem was, fear only worked until someone pushed back. The bell above the diner's door jingled, breaking the tension. A teenager walked in, his hoodie pulled up, his shoulders hunched. He glanced nervously toward the window before making a beeline for the counter. "They're back," he muttered to Melvin. "3 bikes this time, blocking the alley." Melvin's face darkened, but he didn't move. Snoop, however, pushed out of the booth and headed for the door without a word. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. The 3 bikes gleamed under the glow, lined up like metal predators waiting to pounce. Their riders stood nearby, dressed in leather jackets and heavy boots, their faces partially obscured by bandanas and helmets. One of them turned, locking eyes with Snoop. The man stepped forward, the patch on his jacket displaying a snarling wolf's head surrounded by flames. His eyes scanned Snoop's Cadillac, lingering on the rims and gold trim before returning to Snoop himself. "Nice ride," the biker said. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it, sharp and intentional. Snoop didn't flinch. "Appreciate it?" The biker circled the Cadillac, dragging his fingers along the hood. "Shame if something happened to it. These streets ain't too friendly lately. You might want to park somewhere else." Snoop stepped closer. "I've been parking here since before you knew how to ride that little toy of yours. I ain't moving." The biker smirked and took a step back, raising his hands. "Suit yourself. Just remember, I warned you." With that, he turned, climbed onto his bike, and kicked the engine to life. The others followed, their engines roaring like thunder as they sped down the street. Snoop watched them go, his hands clenched into fists. When he turned back to the diner, Melvin was standing in the doorway, his face heavy with worry. "They'll be back," Melvin said. Snoop nodded. "Let 'em come." As he climbed back into his Cadillac, the reflection of the biker's taillights lingered in his rearview mirror. Something in the air had shifted. This wasn't just noise or vandalism. This was a threat, and threats demanded answers. The Cadillac DeVille stood under the flickering glow of the streetlight, its gleaming exterior now marked by the smudged fingerprints of the biker who had circled it like a predator. Snoop leaned against the hood, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the darkened street where the motorcycles had disappeared. The distant hum of engines still echoed in his ears, fading slowly but leaving a trail of unease behind. Melvin stepped out of the diner, wiping his hands on a stained rag. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at the car and then at Snoop, as if waiting for him to speak. "They always roll through like that?" Snoop finally asked, breaking the silence. Melvin shook his head. "Not always. Started small, like I said, revving engines, scaring the kids. But the last couple weeks?" He let out a slow breath. "They've been getting bolder, breaking windows, slashing tires. Couple nights ago, they cornered a kid behind the laundromat. Beat him up pretty bad." Snoop's jaw tightened. He could feel the tension building in his chest, that old fire he thought he'd left behind in the streets. "They doing this everywhere?" "Nah," Melvin said, "just here. Mostly this block and a few over by the tracks. But it's spreading. Folks are scared to come out at night. Can't even call the cops. They show up late, if they show up at all." Snoop exhaled slowly and looked back at his Cadillac. The shine was still there, but the mark left by the biker's touch felt like a scar. He'd worked too hard to build his name, his life, to let it be disrespected like this. "They say what they want." Melvin hesitated. "They don't have to. You can see it in the way they act, the way they look at people who don't look like them. It ain't just about power. It's about sending a message, telling folks they don't belong." The words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and hard to swallow. Snoop turned back toward the diner, motioning for Melvin to follow him inside. The door jingled as it closed behind them, But the noise didn't feel comforting this time. It felt fragile, like a barrier that wouldn't hold if the wolves outside decided to push through. Snoop slid back into the booth by the window, his gaze fixed on the street. Melvin leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Tell me about their leader," Snoop said. Melvin nodded. "They call him Wolf. Big guy, tatted up, head shaved, always got that look like he's daring you to step out of line. Word is, he's ex-military. Dishonorable discharge. Came back with a chip on his shoulder and started running with the wrong crowd. Built himself a little empire, and now he thinks he's untouchable. You ever see him?" "A few times. He don't come around unless he's making a point." Snoop's mind worked fast, piecing together what he'd seen and what he'd just heard. He knew men like Wolf, men who thrived on fear and control, the kind of men who didn't stop until someone stopped them. The bell above the door rang again. This time it was a teenager, maybe 17, with a split lip and a bruise swelling under his eye. He glanced nervously around the diner before heading straight to Melvin. "They're back," the kid said, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 bikes this time, blocking the alley. Melvin cursed under his breath and started to move, but Snoop was already standing. "I'll handle it," he said. Melvin opened his mouth to protest, but the look in Snoop's eyes shut him down. Outside, the night felt heavier than before. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the alley behind the diner seemed darker than it had any right to be. Snoop stepped out, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. The 3 bikes were parked in a tight formation, engines off but still warm. Their riders leaned against the walls, laughing and smoking. One of them spotted Snoop first and nudged the others. "Well, well," the tallest one said, pushing off the wall. "Look who couldn't take a hint." Snoop didn't stop walking until he was right in front of them. "You touch my car again, and you'll regret it." The tall one laughed. "Your car? Man, this whole block's ours now. That piece of junk's just the first thing we're taking." Before Snoop could respond, the biker flicked his cigarette onto the pavement and stepped closer, invading his space. "You think your name means something here?" he said. "It don't. Not anymore." Snoop didn't back down. He didn't blink. "You don't know whose street you're standing on?" The biker grinned, but it wasn't friendly. "Yeah? Why don't you show me?" Snoop's fists clenched at his sides, but he knew better than to make the first move. Instead, he stared the man down until the tension was thick enough to choke on. Finally, the biker stepped back and smirked. "Not tonight. But don't worry, we'll be seeing you real soon." He climbed onto his bike, kicked the engine to life, and roared out of the alley. The others followed, leaving behind the stench of burnt rubber and bad intentions. Snoop stood there long after the sound of their engines had faded, his heart pounding and his mind racing. When he turned back toward the diner, Melvin was waiting in the doorway, his face tight with worry. "They'll be back," Melvin said. Snoop nodded. "I know." The drive home was quiet, but his thoughts were loud. Memories of old battles played in his head, fights for respect, for survival, for pride. He'd walked away from that life, built something better. But tonight, standing in that alley, he felt it all rushing back. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he already knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this slide. He couldn't let them think they owned the streets, not his streets. As he killed the engine and stepped out of the Cadillac, the reflection in the polished chrome showed more than just his face. It showed resolve. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night hung heavy over Los Angeles. Snoop sat on the steps of his front porch, the glow of his blunt fading in the darkness. The confrontation in the alley replayed in his mind. Every word, every smirk, every rev of the engines. The city felt different now, less like home and more like a battlefield. He had been away too long. His phone buzzed. It was Melvin. "They're back," the old man said, his voice tight. Snoop didn't need to ask who. "They're messing with your car, dog." The line went dead before Snoop could respond. He jumped to his feet, tossing the blunt onto the pavement, and sprinted to the Cadillac. By the time he got there, the damage was already done. The Cadillac DeVille, his pride and joy, his symbol of success and survival, was barely recognizable. The windshield was shattered, spiderweb cracks stretching across the glass. The hood was dented and scraped, the sleek black paint marred by deep gouges. One of the side mirrors hung by a wire, swinging limply. Spray paint covered the doors, white and red slashes forming crude symbols, including a swastika. Snoop stood frozen, his fists trembling at his sides. Melvin stepped out of the diner, shaking his head. "They didn't even try to hide it," he said. Snoop barely heard him. All he could see was the Cadillac. All he could hear was the mocking laughter from the alley. "They left this," Melvin added, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. Snoop snatched it and unfolded it. "Not your streets anymore." The words hit harder than fists. Snoop crumpled the note and shoved it into his pocket. The street around him felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. He turned back to Melvin. "Who saw it happen?" "Couple kids across the street," Melvin said. "They didn't stick around, though, scared out of their minds." "Did they see where they went?" Melvin shook his head. Snoop turned back to the Cadillac. He ran his fingers over the scratches and dents, feeling the anger build inside him. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a message, a declaration of war. The sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance snapped him out of his thoughts. It was faint, but growing louder. Snoop's eyes narrowed. "They ain't done yet," he muttered. Melvin reached for his phone. "I'll call the cops." "Don't," Snoop cut him off. Melvin looked at him like he was crazy. "What the hell you mean, don't? You can't handle this alone." Snoop stepped away from the car, his eyes locked on the direction of the approaching sound. "Watch me." The motorcycle roared closer, and Snoop moved to the side of the diner, melting into the shadows. He didn't have a plan, just instinct. The bike slowed as it approached, the rider scanning the street like a predator hunting prey. Snoop waited until the bike was close enough, then stepped out of the shadows. The rider saw him too late. With one swift motion, Snoop grabbed a loose brick from the ground and hurled it. It hit the front wheel, sending the bike skidding out of control. The rider tumbled onto the pavement, rolling before coming to a stop. Snoop was on him before he could get up, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. "Where's the rest of them?" Snoop growled. The rider, young, probably no older than 20, spat blood and tried to wriggle free. "Wrong question," he said with a bloody grin. "You should be asking when they're coming back." Snoop slammed him harder against the wall. "Answer me." "They ain't far," the kid hissed, "but you're already too late." Snoop's gut tightened. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" The kid smirked. "You'll see." The sound of more engines shattered the quiet. Not one, not two, dozens. Snoop dropped the kid and turned just as the headlights appeared down the street. The wolves had come. Snoop ran back toward the Cadillac, but it was too late. The bikes surrounded him, their headlights blinding and their engines deafening. The riders revved their motors, closing in like vultures. One of them stepped forward. Wolf. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a shaved head and eyes as cold as steel. The swastika tattoo on his neck caught the light, making it impossible to ignore. "Nice ride," he said, motioning to the Cadillac. Or it was. Snoop didn't move. "You think you can come back here and act like you own this place?" Wolf continued. "Nah, that's done. This is our block now." "You don't own shit," Snoop shot back. Wolf's grin vanished. "You don't get it, do you? This ain't about you. This is about what you stand for. Everything you built, everything you think makes you somebody, we're tearing it down." He snapped his fingers and the bikers moved in. Snoop fought. He took down the first one with a punch that dropped him cold. The second went down with a kick to the knee. But there were too many. They grabbed him, dragged him to the ground, and pinned him against the pavement. Wolf knelt beside him. "You had your time," Wolf said. "Now it's ours." He stood and kicked Snoop hard in the ribs before walking away. The bikers followed, leaving Snoop gasping on the pavement. Melvin ran out of the diner, helping him to his feet. "We gotta get you out of here," Melvin said. "No," Snoop coughed. "We gotta end this." The Cadillac sat broken, but it wasn't dead. And neither was Snoop. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Snoop sat in Melvin's dimly lit diner long after the roar of the motorcycles had faded into the night. The echoes still rang in his ears, mixing with the throb of bruises along his ribs and shoulders. The place was quiet now, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional scrape of a fork against a plate from the only other customer in the corner. Melvin brought over a fresh cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. "You sure you don't want me to call somebody?" "I already told you," Snoop said, his voice low but firm. "I got this." Melvin shook his head. "You can't take these guys on alone. I saw what they did to you. Hell, I saw what they did to your car." Snoop looked out the window at the Cadillac, still parked out front like a fallen soldier. Its broken glass and dented frame gleamed under the flickering streetlight. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol, and right now, it was a reminder that symbols could be shattered. "That's why I'm not going alone," Snoop said. He took a long sip of coffee and set the cup down. "But I'm not calling the cops, and I'm not running to anybody who doesn't know these streets. I need people I trust, people who've been through it before." Melvin leaned against the counter. "And you got people like that?" Snoop looked up, his eyes sharp. "Yeah, I do." The first stop was the gym. The smell of sweat and leather hit Snoop as soon as he stepped through the doors. Heavy bags swung back and forth, and the rhythmic sound of fists pounding against them filled the air. In the far corner, a man built like a brick wall barked instructions at a group of young fighters. Rico. He spotted Snoop and raised an eyebrow before dismissing the kids. "What brings you here, old man?" Rico asked, pulling off his gloves and slapping them down on the ring's edge. "Trouble," Snoop said. Rico crossed his arms. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that rolls in on two wheels and leaves nothing but wreckage behind." Rico's eyes darkened. "Bikers?" "Worse. Racist punks with something to prove." Rico stepped out of the ring and grabbed a towel, wiping the sweat from his face. "What'd they do?" Snoop didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Rico saw the bruises on his arms and the stiffness in the way he moved. "They trashed my car," Snoop finally said, "and they think they own the streets." Rico tossed the towel aside. "What's the plan?" Snoop smirked. "Thought you'd never ask." Next was Tony's garage. The place looked more like a junkyard than a repair shop, but Tony had a reputation for working miracles. Snoop found him under the hood of an old Impala, his hands covered in grease. Tony didn't even look up. If you're here to talk about that mess parked outside, I already saw it. Damn shame, man. I need it fixed, Snoop said. Tony finally straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. You need more than a fix. That thing's totaled. Can you do it? Tony snorted. Of course I can do it. Question is, why bother? You planning to put it in a museum or something? No, Snoop said. I'm planning to drive it straight through their front door. Tony stared at him for a long moment, then grinned. Now you're talking. The last stop was Liza's apartment. She answered the door wearing ripped jeans and a tank top, her dark hair tied back. She had a cigarette in one hand and a knife in the other. What do you want, Snoop? I need information. Liza leaned against the doorframe. About what? The bikers. Her expression hardened. I told you to stay away from them. And I didn't listen, Snoop said. Now I need to find out where they hang out, how many of them there are, and what they've got. Liza flicked her cigarette into the alley and folded her arms. And what do I get if I help you? You get your neighborhood back, Snoop said. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. The apartment was small and cluttered, with maps and photos pinned to the walls. Liza didn't just know about the bikers. She'd been tracking them. They've been operating out of an old warehouse near the tracks, she said, pointing to a marked spot on the map. Used to be a steel factory, but it's been abandoned for years. They turned it into a clubhouse, part garage, part bar, and probably part armory. How many? Too many, Liza said. At least 30 regulars, plus whoever they bring in from out of town. And they're armed. Guns, bats, chains, you name it. Snoop nodded. Good, that's all I needed to know. Liza grabbed his arm. This isn't a game, Snoop. These guys don't play fair. You need to be ready for that. I'm ready, he said. She let go, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. By the end of the night, the team was assembled. Rico for muscle, Tony for repairs, Liza for intel. They met back at the diner, sitting in the corner booth while Melvin locked the doors and turned off the lights. We don't have much time, Snoop said, spreading Liza's map out on the table. They're expecting me to back down, but we're not giving them that chance. Rico cracked his knuckles. What's the first move? We hit them where it hurts, Snoop said. We cut off their exits and make sure they know we're coming. Tony leaned in. And then? Snoop's eyes hardened. And then we finish it. Outside, the street was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't fear. It was the calm before the storm. The night air hung heavy over the city as Snoop stood outside the diner, his eyes locked on the battered Cadillac DeVille parked under the flickering streetlight. The car's broken windows and dented frame reflected his own bruised ribs and aching muscles, but neither the car nor its owner was ready to quit. Not yet. Inside the diner, the team was gearing up. Rico tested the weight of a crowbar in his hands, its steel gleaming under the dim light. Tony wiped grease off his fingers, double-checking a box of tools in the corner. Liza sat at the booth, her fingers dancing across her phone as she tapped into the city's web of cameras and contacts. Snoop stepped back inside, the door's bell jingling softly. Anything new? Liza didn't look up. I've got eyes on them. 3 bikes just left the warehouse. She flicked her screen toward him, showing grainy footage from a security camera. They're headed west. My guess? They're scouting, checking for cops, looking for us. Rico smirked. Good, let them look. They won't see us coming. Snoop nodded. We need to keep it that way. Tony, the car. Tony stood and grabbed his keys. It's ready to roll. Ain't pretty, but it'll move. Snoop stepped outside to inspect the repairs. The Cadillac was no longer pristine, but it looked mean. Patched up dents, reinforced bumpers, and headlights that glared like predatory eyes. Tony had even installed a metal grill over the windshield. "She's a tank now," Tony said proudly. "Ain't nobody pushing this baby off the road." Snoop ran his hand along the hood, feeling the cold metal under his fingertips. "Let's ride." The plan was simple. Cut the bikers off before they made it back to the warehouse, box them in, and force them to give up the rest of the gang's location. But simple didn't mean easy. The Cadillac roared to life, its engine growling as it rolled out onto the empty streets. Rico followed close behind on a borrowed motorcycle, and Liza kept her car a block back, monitoring the bikers' movements through her phone. They just turned onto 5th. Liza's voice crackled through the Bluetooth speaker. "They're speeding up." Snoop gripped the wheel tighter. "Let's make them sweat." He pressed the gas, the Cadillac surging forward. The night blurred past. Street lights, graffiti-covered walls, and shuttered stores flashing in the rearview mirror. Up ahead, the taillights of the bikers appeared, weaving through traffic like sharks circling prey. "Got 'em?" Rico said over the radio. "Keep them in sight," Snoop replied. The bikers noticed them almost immediately. One of them looked back and revved his engine, signaling to the others. They split up, 2 darting down a side street while the third sped ahead. Snoop didn't hesitate. "I'll take the leader. Rico, cut off the others." The Cadillac's tires screeched as Snoop made the sharp turn, following the lead biker down an alley. Trash cans flew out of the way, and the echo of the motorcycle's engine bounced off the brick walls. The biker glanced back, expecting Snoop to slow down in the narrow passage. Instead, Snoop floored it. The Cadillac barreled forward, closing the gap. The biker tried to swerve, but Snoop clipped the rear tire. The bike skidded sideways, crashing into a dumpster. The rider tumbled to the ground, rolling before scrambling to his feet. Snoop slammed on the brakes and jumped out, reaching the biker before he could run. "Where's Wolf?" Snoop demanded, shoving him against the wall. The biker spat blood, laughing. "You think this changes anything? He's waiting for you." "Where?" "You'll see," the biker hissed. A gunshot rang out, shattering the alley's silence. Snoop ducked instinctively, dragging the biker down with him. "It's a trap," Lisa's voice crackled through the speaker. "They've got backup moving in from the east." Snoop cursed under his breath and shoved the biker away. "Rico, you good?" "Still on the 2, Rico replied, his voice strained. "They're heading toward the bridge." Snoop jumped back into the Cadillac and slammed the door. "I'm coming." The bridge loomed ahead, its steel beams cutting through the night sky. Rico was already halfway across, his bike weaving between the 2 remaining bikers. Snoop's Cadillac roared onto the bridge, headlights slicing through the darkness. The bikers noticed too late. One of them tried to swerve, but Rico cut him off, forcing him toward the railing. The biker lost control and spun out, his bike crashing into the guardrail. The last one made a break for the far end of the bridge, but Snoop was faster. He floored the gas, closing the distance. The Cadillac's reinforced bumper hit the back tire, sending the bike skidding sideways. The rider tumbled across the pavement, landing hard. Snoop braked and jumped out. Rico pulled up behind him. "You ain't getting away this time," Snoop growled, grabbing the biker by the jacket and hauling him up. "Where's Wolf?" The biker coughed and winced, blood dripping from his nose. "Warehouse, but it's a setup." Rico leaned in. "How many?" "Everyone," the biker wheezed. "They're ready for you." Snoop let go, letting the biker drop to the ground. Then we'll be ready for them." They regrouped at the diner. The chase had been a warning shot, but it also confirmed what they already knew. The bikers weren't backing down. Snoop leaned over the map on the table, tracing a path toward the warehouse. "We cut off their exits," he said. "They won't see it coming." Rico nodded. "And if they do?" Snoop's eyes hardened. "Then we hit harder." Tony spoke up. "The Cadillac's good to go. I'll reinforce the doors, add a couple more surprises." Liza tapped her phone. "I'll keep tracking their movements. If they try to bring in more people, we'll know." Snoop looked at each of them in turn. "This ends tomorrow." Outside, the night was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't fear. It was anticipation. The storm was coming, and Snoop was ready to ride through it. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged and menacing against the night sky. The old steel factory sat like a fortress on the edge of the industrial district, surrounded by rusted fences and graffiti-covered walls. Floodlights mounted on its roof cut through the darkness, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked pavement. Snoop gripped the wheel of the Cadillac, his eyes locked on the building as he rolled to a stop at the edge of the lot. The car growled quietly, its reinforced frame and dented body looking as battle-scarred as its driver. In the back seat, Rico checked the weight of a crowbar, flexing his fingers around the handle. Liza sat in the passenger's seat, staring at the screens on her phone as live feeds from security cameras flickered in and out. "They're in there," she said, her voice low. "At least 20 of them, probably more. I see weapons, baseball bats, chains, a few handguns. Looks like they're expecting us." "Good," Snoop said. "Let them." Tony's voice crackled through the radio. "I've got your exits covered. If they try to run, I'll block the south gate, but you'll have to move fast. Once they know you're here, they'll bring in reinforcements." Snoop leaned back and lit a blunt, letting the smoke swirl around him before exhaling slowly. "Ain't no reinforcements coming for them. This ends tonight." The plan was simple. Rico and Snoop would hit the front, causing enough noise to draw out the bikers while Liza disabled their vehicles and Tony cut off their escape routes. Once the bikers were boxed in, it would be a fight to the finish. The Cadillac rolled forward, its tires crunching against the gravel. The floodlights caught the glint of the grill, and within seconds the first biker stepped outside. It was one of the scouts from earlier, his face still bruised from the chase. He spotted the car and waved, calling inside. Moments later, more bikers emerged. Snoop didn't slow down. The Cadillac surged forward, its engine roaring as it plowed straight through the flimsy chain-link fence. The metal crumpled like paper and the bikers scrambled backward. Rico jumped out before the car even came to a stop, swinging the crowbar hard against the first man who got too close. The sound of metal cracking against bone echoed across the lot as the man dropped. "Go!" Rico shouted. Snoop kicked open his door and stepped out, gripping a tire iron in one hand. A biker lunged at him with a chain, but Snoop ducked and swung low, knocking the man's legs out from under him. More bikers poured out of the warehouse, their shouts blending into the roar of engines as some tried to escape on their bikes. But Tony's truck came screeching around the corner, blocking the only open exit. Liza's voice came through the earpiece. "You're clear. No one's getting out." Snoop barely heard her. His focus was locked on the entrance of the warehouse, where a familiar figure stepped out into the light. Wolf. The leader of the bikers stood tall, his shaved head gleaming under the floodlights. His leather jacket bore the snarling wolf's head patch, and his hands rested on the grips of a shotgun slung across his chest. "Look who decided to show up." Wolf called out, his voice echoing. "I was starting to think you didn't have the guts." Snoop took a step forward. "You picked the wrong block, Wolf." Wolf grinned, his teeth catching the light. "Nah, I picked the right one. And now I'm taking it." He raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed like thunder, shattering the windshield of the Cadillac. Snoop dove for cover, rolling behind the car as glass rained down around him. Rico charged forward, swinging the crowbar, but Wolf's men closed in fast. The fight turned brutal. Chains whipped through the air and fists connected with flesh. Rico fought like a man possessed, dropping one biker after another, but there were too many. Snoop came up behind one of them, slamming the tire iron into his ribs. The man crumpled, and Snoop grabbed his bat, using it to deflect another swing aimed at his head. Wolf fired again, the blast narrowly missing Rico and hitting the Cadillac's hood. Snoop moved fast, darting around the car and closing the distance. Wolf tried to reload, but Snoop tackled him, driving him to the ground. The shotgun skidded away, and Wolf came up swinging. He was fast and strong, but Snoop had been in too many fights to go down easy. Wolf landed a punch that split Snoop's lip, but Snoop responded with a hard elbow to the jaw, knocking him back. "You ain't running this block," Snoop growled, grabbing Wolf by the collar and slamming him against the car. Wolf spit blood and grinned. "This ain't over." Snoop hit him again, this time hard enough to send him sprawling. Behind him, Rico and Tony finished off the last of the bikers. The lot was littered with bodies, some groaning, others unconscious. Liza's voice came through the radio. "Cops are coming. You need to move." Snoop wiped the blood from his face and looked down at Wolf. "This is my block," he said. "Don't forget it." He turned and walked away, leaving Wolf gasping on the ground. The Cadillac roared to life as they pulled out of the lot, its broken frame rattling but still moving. Tony's truck followed close behind, and Liza's car brought up the rear. The fight was over, but Snoop knew the war wasn't done. Not yet. As they disappeared into the night, the warehouse burned behind them, the flames lighting up the sky. It wasn't just a victory. It was a message. This city belonged to them, and no one was taking it back. The night smelled of burnt rubber and gasoline. Smoke curled from the remnants of the fire at the warehouse, its glow still faintly visible in the distance. Snoop's Cadillac DeVille rattled down the cracked streets, its engine growling as if it, too, was hungry for more. The windshield was gone, the hood scorched, and the dents along its sides told the story of the battle they'd just survived. But it still moved. Rico sat in the passenger seat, his knuckles raw and bleeding. Tony followed close behind in his truck, headlights cutting through the darkness, while Liza trailed in her car, keeping an eye out for any lingering threats. No one spoke. The adrenaline was still high, but the silence wasn't peace. It was tension, thick and electric, buzzing just beneath the surface. Snoop's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The image of Wolf, bloodied but still grinning through broken teeth, burned in his mind. This wasn't over. The bikers were broken, scattered, but Wolf had slipped away. Not far, Snoop could feel it. He wasn't the type to run. Not really. He was the type to regroup, reload, and come back harder, and Snoop couldn't let that happen. He pulled up outside the diner, parking the Cadillac in its usual spot. Melvin stepped out, eyes wide as he took in the damage. "Damn," Melvin muttered. "Looks like hell caught up with you." Snoop stepped out of the car and nodded toward the door. "Coffee, now." Melvin didn't argue. Inside, the team gathered at their usual booth. Liza spread out her phone and maps, already scanning for signs of movement. Tony lit a cigarette, his hands still trembling slightly from the fight. Rico leaned back, an ice pack pressed to his swollen knuckles. Snoop didn't sit. He paced. "Talk to me," he said, glancing at Liza. "They're regrouping," she said, her voice tense. "I've got reports of bikes heading west, warehouse district again, but not the same spot, an old freight yard near the river." "Wolf?" "Not confirmed," she said, swiping through grainy footage, "but I'd bet on it. He's not done, not by a long shot." Snoop exhaled sharply. "Then neither are we." Rico leaned forward. "Man, we just took down their base. You think they're ready for round 2 already?" "They don't have a choice," Snoop said. "Wolf's ego won't let him back down. He has to make a statement, same as we did." Tony flicked ash into a tray. "Then we make the next move first." Snoop nodded. "Exactly." The freight yard was dark and quiet when they arrived, but the stillness felt wrong. It wasn't peace, it was a trap waiting to spring. Snoop killed the engine, and the group fanned out, sticking to the shadows. Liza stayed back, her phone glowing faintly as she monitored the feeds. "They're here," she whispered through the earpiece. "I count at least 10 bikes, maybe more inside the warehouse. Lights are on, and I'm picking up heat signatures. They're armed." Rico hefted a crowbar. "Good. So are we." Snoop motioned for them to move. They slipped through the fence, their footsteps muffled against the gravel. The warehouse door hung slightly ajar, light spilling out onto the lot. Snoop signaled to Rico and Tony to flank the sides while he moved straight ahead. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and sweat. Bikers milled around, drinking and laughing, but their weapons were never far from reach. And in the center, sitting on a crate like a king on his throne, was Wolf. His lip was split and one eye was swollen shut, but he still grinned when he saw Snoop step through the door. "I knew you'd come back," Wolf said, standing slowly. The room went quiet as the bikers turned to face Snoop. "You should have run when you had the chance," Snoop replied. Wolf chuckled. "Run? This is my city now. And you're just another relic that doesn't know when to stay buried." The tension snapped. Wolf reached for the gun at his waist, but Snoop was faster. He lunged, knocking the gun aside and driving Wolf back. The bikers surged forward, but Rico and Tony hit them hard, swinging bats and crowbars. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Snoop and Wolf traded blows, fists, elbows, knees, each hit landing like thunder. Wolf was strong, but Snoop was faster, years of street fights giving him the edge. Wolf swung wild, and Snoop ducked, coming up with an uppercut that sent Wolf stumbling back into a stack of crates. "You think this is over?" Wolf spat, wiping blood from his mouth. "It is for you," Snoop said, stepping closer. Wolf lunged again, but Snoop sidestepped, grabbing a length of chain from the ground and wrapping it around Wolf's arm. He yanked hard, pulling Wolf off balance and slamming him to the floor. The fight ended with Wolf on his knees, blood dripping onto the concrete. Snoop leaned in close. "You don't run this city. Not now. Not ever." Wolf glared up at him, but the fight was gone from his eyes. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder. Liza's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Cops are almost there. You need to go." Snoop stood and looked around. The bikers were down, scattered or unconscious. Rico and Tony were already moving toward the exit. "Let's roll," Snoop said. They left Wolf behind, broken and beaten, as the cops swarmed the yard. Back at the diner, the mood was lighter, but the tension hadn't fully lifted. Melvin poured coffee for everyone, his hands steady now. "What happens next?" Rico asked. Snoop stared out the window at the Cadillac. "We rebuild." Liza leaned back. "You think it's over?" Snoop didn't answer right away. He took a sip of coffee, letting the heat settle in his chest. "It's never over," he said finally, "but it's our city now." Outside, the streets were quiet, for now, but Snoop knew peace wouldn't last forever, and that was fine, because this time, he'd be ready. The early morning light crept over Los Angeles, stretching across cracked sidewalks and faded murals that lined the streets. The city felt different, quieter, as if it had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. But Snoop wasn't fooled. Quiet didn't mean safe. It only meant the storm had passed, for now. The Cadillac DeVille sat outside Melvin's diner, battered but standing. Its broken windows and dented frame told the story of the war that had just been fought, and the scars it carried would not be erased any time soon. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and bacon. The booths were empty except for Snoop and his team gathered around the corner table. Plates of half-eaten pancakes and untouched toast sat between them, but no one was hungry. Not after the night they'd had. Rico sat back, cradling a cup of black coffee in his bruised hands. "You think it's over?" he asked, his voice rough from exhaustion. Snoop leaned back, staring out the window at the quiet streets. "It's never over," he said. "Not in this city." Tony tossed a wrench onto the table, the metal clinking against the wood. "Well, they'll think twice before coming back here. We sent a message." Liza looked up from her phone, her eyes sharp despite the dark circles under them. "You sure they got it? Wolf might be down, but he's not out. And his people? They won't forget." Snoop didn't respond right away. He knew Liza was right. Wolf was a symbol for those bikers, a leader, but also a mindset. Even with him broken and bloodied, the hate and fear he represented wouldn't disappear overnight. "They'll come back," Snoop said finally. "Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but they will." "So, what do we do?" Rico asked. Snoop set his coffee down and leaned forward. "We rebuild. We show them this is still our city and we ain't going nowhere." The first step was fixing the Cadillac. Tony's garage was already humming with activity by the time Snoop pulled in. The car groaned as it rolled through the open bay doors, its frame creaking in protest. Tony circled it, shaking his head. "You sure this thing's worth saving?" Snoop patted the hood. "She's been through worse." Tony grinned and popped the hood. "All right, let's bring her back." It took hours. The engine had taken a beating, and the bodywork looked like it had been through a war zone, which, technically, it had. But, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, Tony and his crew worked. Snoop stayed the whole time, wiping grease from his hands and lending a hand where he could. He wasn't just fixing a car. He was reclaiming something bigger, proof that you couldn't be pushed out of your own home. By nightfall, the Cadillac was back on its wheels. It wasn't perfect, the dents were hammered out, but you could still see the scars if you looked close enough, and Snoop liked it that way. "This ain't just a car anymore," Tony said, wiping his hands. "This is armor." The next step was the neighborhood. Snoop drove through the streets, windows down, the Cadillac rumbling like a warning. People turned and waved, some stepping out of their homes just to watch him pass. He stopped at the corner store where the first signs of trouble had started. The broken windows were boarded up, but kids were already outside playing basketball, their laughter echoing off the walls. Melvin stood by the diner talking to a group of neighbors who'd come out to help clean up the alley. He looked up as Snoop pulled in, nodding in approval. "You done good, dog," Melvin said, "real good." "It ain't done yet," Snoop replied, stepping out. "We still got work to do." The last step was sending a message. Snoop drove back to the warehouse, now abandoned. The fire from the night before had blackened the walls, and the lot was littered with debris. It felt smaller now, emptier. Rico and Liza joined him, standing by the Cadillac as the sun dipped below the horizon. "What now?" Liza asked. Snoop pulled out a can of spray paint and stepped up to the wall. With slow, deliberate movements, he covered the scorch marks and graffiti left by the bikers. When he stepped back, a new symbol stared back at them, bold and defiant. It wasn't a gang tag, it wasn't a threat, it was a crown. "We take back what's ours," Snoop said. Rico grinned. "Damn right." The weeks passed, and the neighborhood changed. The streets were quieter at night, but this time it wasn't fear that kept people inside. It was peace. The bikers had vanished, scattered after their leader fell, and the scars they left behind began to heal. The diners stayed open late, and the basketball courts were always full. Murals appeared on the walls, images of unity, strength, and resilience. And through it all, the Cadillac kept rolling, its rumble a reminder that this neighborhood didn't bow to anyone. But Snoop never let his guard down. He knew the streets too well to believe in fairy tales. Peace wasn't permanent. It was something you fought for every day. And he was ready for that fight. Late one night, he sat on his porch, the Cadillac parked in the driveway. The city stretched out before him, its lights flickering like stars. The phone buzzed. It was Liza. "We might have a problem," she said. Snoop didn't flinch. "When?" "Not sure yet, but soon." Snoop leaned back, letting the night air wash over him. "Let me know," he said. He hung up and lit a blunt, the smoke curling up into the night sky. The streets were his, and no one was taking them away. Not now. Not ever. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel not to miss new videos. Share this video with your friends and leave comments. We want to know what you think. See also our other stories that are already waiting for you on the channel.